I would like first to compare the philosophies that underlie Western society, and at least how I perceive it, versus the philosophy of Islam that I grew up with. The way I've come to differentiate it for myself is by thinking of Islam as a philosophy of the hereafter, and the philosophy of Western liberal democracies of being a philosophy of life on earth. When I was born into Islam, I was groomed into thinking, and you will read all about that in Infidel and in Nomad, that life on earth is short, it's temporary. And all you have to do is follow a series of obligations. Abstain from a series of things that are not permitted, the haram. There are a number of things that are permitted that you can enjoy, but essentially, your life on earth is a test. Life will start, real eternal life will start after the grave, when you die. While on earth, you have two angels on either side of your shoulders. You can't see them. This was told to me by my mother, my grandmother, my Quran teacher, my father. When we lived in Saudi Arabia, all of our teachers, it was complete socialization from every single adult and every authority that we trusted. You have two angels on either side of your shoulders. The one on the left side will record all of the sins that you commit, the wrong things. So if you indulge in the haram, that which is forbidden, the angel on your left shoulder will record all of that. For instance, if you eat pork, which as a child was very funny because there were no pigs, there was no pork available. If you drink alcohol, if you indulge in sex before marriage or outside of marriage, if you interact, make friends with the infidels and the Jews, if you stray from prayer, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day, and if you miss one of them, the angel on your left side will quickly note that down. So you have a book there, you can't see him, you can't see the book, you can't feel it. You used to walk like this. On your right shoulder, you have the angel that notes down all the good things that you do. You pray 5 times a day, you think of Allah all the time, you obey and do what Muhammad told you to do, you partake of that which is permitted in moderation, you're kind and generous, you give money for zakat or for the charity, those who have less than you. You go once a year to Hajj, or even you think of going. All of these good deeds, good intentions, all of that will be recorded by the angel on your right hand, who's going to make a book. Now, you can be tempted. You can do something wrong. But if you ask for forgiveness, then the angel on your left hand will erase some of the stuff that he noted that you asked repentance for, and that will all go onto your right shoulder. So there is the concept of forgiveness and redemption exists in Islam. But Allah can see and look into every heart and every intention. So if you keep falling into the same, trap, if you keep missing your prayers, or you keep drinking, or you keep eating pork, or you keep having non-Muslim friends, you ask for forgiveness, but you keep doing it, that angel on your right shoulder is going to stop forgiving you, and the one on your left shoulder will keep recording it. That is basically the concept. Now, what happens when you die? When you're in your grave, another angel will come, and he's going to ask you 3 questions. Who is Allah? Who is Muhammad? And who is in the Quran? I forget the 3rd question. But in any case, you answer those 3 questions, and you will have a quiet and peaceful time in your grave. If you don't, if you had been sinning for too much and you can't answer those questions, then you're going to be tortured in the grave. The grave is going to squeeze, your bonds will break, you will have a very long time of discomfort and pain in the grave. Now that's just a temporary punishment. When you cross the border and you go to the other side, after death, Allah is going to hold a huge tribunal. Everybody is going to wake up on the day of judgment, and everybody is going to be tried. And your own body parts, your fingers, your nose, your mouth, everything will bear witness against you. And as you stand in front of the judge of all judges, the greatest judge of all, Allah himself, your two books are presented. And if your book on the left side, I don't understand, as I talk about this, I think, why is the left so interested in protecting the image of Islam? In any case, we got that wrong, I think. When you wake up and you're on the other side, if your left-hand book if it weighs heavier than the book written by the angel on the right shoulder, then the answer is very simple. If you are a Muslim, you go to hell. Hell is a place where you burn. And depending on how thick that book is, but that only applies to you if you are a Muslim, depending on how thick that book was, you are punished for a number of years, a period in the hereafter that is not made explicit in either the Quran or the Hadith. If the book on your right shoulder is heavier, you go to heaven. And in heaven, eternal life begins. That is the life that you invest in. That is where you relax. There are gardens and fountains. There is fruit. For the men, there are an endless number of virgins, 72 of them. For the women, there are dates, and there are grapes, and there is water. I know, it's not fair. Nothing is fair, not even in heaven. The sweetest wine. So when you're on earth and if you want wine, you're told, stay away from it because that will cost you the wine in the hereafter, which is the sweetest and the best and the most wonderful wine ever. So I'm telling you this to contrast it with, first of all, to tell you, as children, we are groomed from the very beginning to invest in the hereafter, to invest in life after death. So our resources, our creativity, our energy, everything, if you're born into Islam, goes into investing in the hereafter. Then I come to the Netherlands in 1992, and I think most of you by now are familiar with the story. And I enter a society that invests in a philosophy of life on earth. You send your children to school. You teach them gradually how to make careers for themselves and become successful in those careers. How to become old and avoid pitfalls. You know, if you die, your life is shortened. Lives are saved. It's all about life, all the innovation, the entertainment, the recreation, the rights, everything is all. Look at Canadian society. Look at you. I look at the number of people here and the average age, and I think that here is a society that invests in life, in getting younger, in staying young, in staying healthy. And the hereafter is not something that a lot of people talked about. I befriended a few Christians that were considered to be very, very orthodox in the Netherlands, and they hardly ever talked about, they did talk about the hereafter, but they hardly ever talked about how that looked like. There was a heaven, if you were a Christian, and you asked for redemption, but they didn't describe what you would get in heaven. They just said heaven and pointed upwards. So that's just as my first point is, if you want to get the difference between the Islamic civilization and the Western civilization, it is very, very important that we start there. You invest in one civilization, you invest in the hereafter, the other civilization, you invest on life on earth. Now I come to my second point, and that is, if you live in a society that invests in the hereafter, you develop a legal system that is pertinent and consistent with that philosophy. That philosophy gave birth to a legal system called Sharia, or Islamic law. And if you study Islamic law in its details, it's all geared toward one concept, and that is forbidding wrong and commanding good, or commanding right. Every single individual has the responsibility to make sure that that manual of obligations is taken seriously by observant Muslims, that they follow it. That the forbidden stuff, that people stay away from that, and that people only do what is permissible. Because it's difficult for every society to have every individual policing that, because you create anarchy and therefore fitna, chaos, you have a legal system whereby the state, or the caliph, we don't have the concept of a king in Islam, but the caliph or the sultan or whoever enforces that. When you go to Saudi Arabia, or you read about the Saudis having a police force that forces people to be virtuous on the streets, actually enforces it, and commands right, that is the concept behind it. Women and men have a specified role in society. It's spelled out how they should interact with one another. It is completely clear what is right and what is wrong. And when it's not clear, when there are gray areas, it's better to do what is right. The Sharia legal system has its own tribunals, and you cannot compare it to the Western system. The Quran is the constitution. The books that Muhammad left behind, his deeds, his thoughts, his way of thinking about what is right and wrong, that is the manual, that's the guideline. And so the state is based on what is in the Quran and the morality of the Prophet Muhammad. Corruption, according to that philosophy, corruption means straying away from that. And individuals don't choose. The choice has been made for you. Individuals have only one thing to do, one role to play, and that is to submit. Submission to that system. When I came to the Netherlands, I found in the philosophy and societies that invest in life on earth a completely different set of rules and a completely different legal system. The rule of law, institutions that were set up to ensure that individual freedoms are not infringed upon, that rights and obligations toward one another were protected on earth, that people could fashion their own lifestyles, both women and men could fashion their lifestyles, and they were protected by the law. And of course, where there are human beings, there's always conflict. And that system of resolving conflict is one where the socialization of children is to learn to talk about it and to bear responsibility for one's own actions. And if that fails to resolve anything, then authority figures punish. And again, the punishments that were chosen that I found in the Netherlands, but you'll find in Canada and elsewhere, was to postpone the use of coercion, the use of force, to save that as an ultimum remedium. You're talking to people, you send them to therapy, you punish them by fining them, etc. And then finally, if all of that fails, then force comes in. People are violent, people are irresponsible, people do things that are not right for them. But again, these institutions that I'm talking about, that you all know about, were styled and evolved toward achieving maximum happiness for the maximum number of people. I don't say that that is achieved or that it's perfect. I'm just giving you an idea of the two different philosophies. Then I come to my third point, which is, why is there a conflict between immigrants who come from Muslim countries to Canada to Australia, to America, to European countries, and the societies that they come into. Why is there a Babylonian misunderstanding, structural misunderstanding between the West and Islam? Why do Americans and Europeans and other Westerners look at Israel in a certain way and the Arab Islamic countries in a different way? And then you get to understand why. Because societies that invest in life on earth, Western societies, think that you can resolve all conflict by using reason, human reason. States are secular. People can be religious, and you have different religions. You can believe in a divine God, but a secular state assumes that you can solve human problems, human conflict by using reason. That doesn't mean every time that everybody is reasonable or that states are reasonable. But the assumption that you can resolve conflict through reason is one thing. The other side believes that Allah has already ordained. You already have the manuals. You know the difference between right and wrong, and do not forget, life on earth is temporary. You are investing in the hereafter. When individuals in Western society trying to integrate Muslims into Western society ask the question, why is it that Muslims don't assimilate? Why are they neglecting their children? Why? What is wrong? Why do they object to modernity? Why do they reject modernity? Please understand that in a philosophy, in a society where you invest in the hereafter, it means that people are directing their energies and their resources and their investments toward the hereafter. If you go to Quran schools or Muslim schools, you are taught how not to sin, how to be a good Muslim, how to find for yourself a good place in heaven. If it was only that much, and people will ask, but how come Christians also have a hereafter, and Jews have a hereafter, and Buddhists believe in the reincarnation of humans into something else, animals and inanimate objects? Why is it interesting to only focus and study Islam's fixation on the hereafter? Well, number one, scale. The number of people who identify themselves as Muslim and who are investing in that form of a hereafter exceed 1 billion, probably 1.5 billion. There is what is now called the Islamist movement or the jihadist movement, a very successful movement that wants to redirect Muslims who have strayed away from the straight path, who have strayed away from investing in the hereafter, who have been tempted by modernity and sin to come back and again go on the straight path and invest in the hereafter. And that requires the second concept, which goes from not only commanding right and forbidding wrong, but also the obligation of every Muslim to tell every other Muslim to go back to the faith. And if that fails, then to declare that person an enemy of Islam, an enemy of God, a heretic, and force him back on. But it doesn't only stop with individuals who are born into Islam. The enemies of Islam extend to the whole of humanity. If you reject that message of the hereafter, of one God, of one prophet, then it's the obligation of Muslims, Muslim leaders, to force you back to accepting it. And it starts first with proselytization called da'wah, and if that fails, then jihad or holy war. You choose to die if you refuse to take Allah as your only God and Muhammad as his prophet. That is a universalist principle. Saudi Arabia has invested tons and tons of money trying to spread that message as peacefully as they can. With the oil money that they have, they've built Islamic centers, they've built mosques, they've built schools, not only in Muslim countries, but numerous Muslim centers and mosques also in Western countries, fast targeting Muslim immigrants. Now compare it to the other universalist liberal view, the Western view, where there's also a lot of energy spent on trying to modernize and trying to develop countries that first were labeled third world and now politically correctly developing worlds. Lift them out of poverty. The message that these non-governmental organizations and government-funded development aid, the philosophy behind it is life on earth. It is good to live. It is good to be healthy. It is great to invest in careers. The philosophy behind it is moral to have a life on earth that is as long as possible, as healthy as possible, as peaceful as possible. Again, these two philosophies conflict. The one that is geared toward the hereafter considers the one that is geared to life here an enemy, a fatal enemy. Proponents of Islam as a preparation, as life as a preparation for the hereafter, feel that Islam is under siege. It is under siege by innovators, by people who are developing all kinds of technologies, by people who are misleading others to invest in the temporary life and to take them away from the eternal life, the good life that is going to happen afterwards. In conclusion, if you put these philosophies next to one another, what you see is one philosophy is a philosophy of life. The other philosophy is a philosophy of death. And I call it a philosophy of death, however noble it is, and however grand its discourse and its narrative. I call it a philosophy of death because you can't argue about what is going to happen in the hereafter. In order to have a logical discussion of that, you have to die first. You have to get to the hereafter first. The philosophy of death has as an instrument, and I try to explain that in Nomad, it needs enemies because it promises utopia. The enemies are those who reject the faith. First of all, Islam was founded in Mecca to a pagan society, in an Arab desert society, and those who first rejected the message of Prophet Muhammad were labeled enemies. They were not enemies, they just wanted to go on worshipping their gods that they had for ages and for centuries before that, but they were labeled enemies. The Jewish minority living in Arabia were also labeled enemies and not to be trusted because they tried to forge alliances with the Prophet, but when the Prophet refused or did things that were not in their interest, then they did something else. And the fact that they did something else made them into liars and enemies of Islam, conspiring to destroy Islam. The Christians were first seen to be benign, stupid people who did not really get the message of the last prophet. But when they continued to reject it, even though they were people of the book, they were still seen as enemies of Islam. And this idea that Islam is under siege has stayed with the religion for centuries. Within Islam, and people born into Islam over the centuries, there were individuals, and sometimes who forged groups who wanted to renovate, who wanted to change the religion, who wanted to innovate. But they never got a chance. They were killed, they were exiled, they were always stifled, unfortunately, by the forces who were ready to cross over to the hereafter. I'm telling you all of this because I think if you pursue a conversation, a dialogue based on logic and a rational dialogue, and you don't get this philosophy of the hereafter, you don't understand why people are willing to die so quickly, why people are sending their little children to die, why they're not investing in school careers, why they're not investing in healthcare, why some of them who do invest again get diverted from it. I think it's very, very important to start first and foremost from there. I don't want to suggest that Islam is the only philosophy or the only set of beliefs that is geared toward the hereafter. If you start reading from the Greek mythologies, from the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians, the Jews, and other philosophies, you will find that humanity has always had fantasies of what might happen after death and how it will look like. But this is different. It's different because of its scale, its intensity, and the success that that story of the hereafter, the martyrdom story, has with young people, a demography that is fast, it's growing at a very, very fast pace. If you want to understand what once upon a time was an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then became an Arab-Israeli conflict, and is now a major Western versus Islamic conflict. That conflict has now become a symbol for that. Why are thousands and thousands of people who have nothing to do with Israel, who don't live in the Middle East, who have their own sets of problems, why are they willing to die, to go to the other side? It's because in that religion, if you attack a Muslim country, or what is perceived to be a Muslim nation, then it is the obligation of every Muslim man to defend it. It's like a NATO organization without the bureaucracy. It's just something you believe. It's a movement. If you want to understand why Turkey, that oppresses its own Kurdish minority, that denies the genocide against the Armenians, is willing to risk its international status, its ties to the United States, its relationship with Israel for that flotilla, please don't just analyze it in terms of the rational, diplomatic manner of resolving conflict that we all have been groomed into, and by we all meaning in the West, Westerners have been groomed into understanding and analyzing that framework. Please look at that other framework of the philosophy of the hereafter versus the philosophy of life. If you want to understand why Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is on a suicidal mission to acquire a bomb and provoke the entire world, if there was a response, if he were to start a nuclear weapon, it is unthinkable what could happen to the Iranian nation. But Mohammed Ahmadinejad is not afraid of death. He welcomes death because he believes deeply that he and those who die will all make it to the other side, that he is doing something righteous, and that he is going to heaven and will be, when the real life begins, the real eternal life begins, he's going to be a hero in the hereafter. I'm going to stop it at this and take your questions for the next half hour. Yeah. This point about knowledge is very important. The concept of a God that Muhammad introduced was a God that you had to submit to fully. And that is what is tested on earth, the level of your submission. How much of yourself do you completely surrender to those rules, those, abstaining from the prohibited, doing only what is permitted, and how far are you willing to go in that form of surrender? For instance, in the male-female relationship, as a female, you're required to completely submit to your husband. Anything he asks goes, except if he asks you to do anything that Allah doesn't want you to do. So you submit fully to Allah. If the Caliph, the leader of the Islamic Ummah, asks you to whatever to do as a subject, you should do it. You should submit, except if he asks you to do things that are sinful, that will take you away from Allah. And that is why a lot of the innovators, even if they make it to the point of a leadership position, have huge difficulty maintaining order and maintaining a hierarchy, because it's the obligation of individual Muslims to go against the Caliph, against the leader, against the Imam, whoever, if they take him away from that position of complete and utter submission to the rules of Allah. A problem that Islam has that I think that Christians and Jews don't have is that some of the rules are so explicit that it's very, very difficult to interpret them in a different way, especially the rules in the hadith. If you are told what should happen to gays, in the Quran, all it says is sodomy is sinful and the gays will be punished and will have to be killed. The hadith specifies exactly how you should do the killing. Take them to the highest building in town, push them over, and get a bunch of believers to stone them before they hit the ground. That kind of explicit commands, flog the adulterer and the adulteress, and then how the flogging is supposed to take place. The thief, cut off the left, amputate the left hand and the right leg, or the right hand and the left leg, and tie them together. You have these kinds of very explicit rules that are very difficult to stray away from. And when a ruler comes around and says, oh, but that is medieval and it violates human rights, then a true believing Muslim will say, but that also violates Allah, and I would rather submit to Allah than submit to you. And I think in the Judeo-Christian concepts of God, I was told the Jewish God is a God that you argue with, and that you discuss with, and it's not a God you submit to, but you just have continuous quarrels with him. The Christian God, what my friends tell me about Christianity, what I read in the Bible is a huge emphasis on redemption and turning the other cheek, and a God of love and a father and all of that. Allah is not a God who tells you turn the other cheek or quarrel with me. Allah tells you submit. And if you don't submit, then you're sinning. The only figure that refused to submit of all the angels in the Islamic myth was Satan. Satan was kicked out of heaven because he refused to bow to Adam because Allah ordered him to. And that saga is continuing, and in that mythical form, that is the concept of Allah we are talking about. So yes, an illiterate prophet introduced a narrative, a discourse, a religion of submission, and it's still carrying on. And those people who do not want to submit are kicked out as Satan or the followers of Satan. Islam was born in an Arab desert patriarchal culture in the 7th century. The man who founded it, as we've just established, and I don't think you disagree with that, was illiterate. In fact, he confesses to that illiteracy in the first word, the first sentence of the revelation. He claims it was a revelation in the Quran. Now, if you read the Quran, if you read the hadith, everything, the legacy of Muhammad, what you will find is that a great deal of that existing culture he simply made it divine. For instance, the mechanism of honor and shame. You'll find a great deal of the word honor and shame coming back over and over in that theology. What he also did was he innovated some of it. When he introduced Sharia law later, when he became strong in Medina, he did a few things that at that time were incredibly progressive in that context. For instance, the Arab tribes used to bury girls that they thought were, if a family got a third or a fourth daughter, and they thought that that was excessive, they used to bury those infants before the age of 7. It was a tradition to do that. These were burials. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't like the Chinese hiding them or throwing them away. And he banned that system. At the time, the number of concubines that a man could have was endless. And he limited that to 4. A man could have 4 wives, and he said, treat them equally. But that the limit is 4. And if you want a 5th wife, then you have to divorce the first wife. He introduced a system of inheritance, and a system of laws, and a system of rights and wrongs. And he united all of those diverse Arab tribes that were killing one another at the time, and he had their energy focused outwards. Instead of conquering one another, they went and conquered others, and it became an empire. So all of these things that Muhammad did were incredibly progressive for that time and impressive. But as Islam, as the theology, went to different cultures, Persia, all the way to China, and even parts of Europe and Africa, what you see is that some of those habits and traditions and convictions that were first insulated within those Arab tribes have now become international. So you'll see a place like Egypt. It is very, very difficult for us now to even see what Egypt looked like before Islam was there. It's completely Arabized. If you look at places in our day, Indonesia, Malaysia, that had their own Buddhist religions or Hinduist religions or whatever their local religions is, you find that now there is a gradual expansion of what we've come to call radical Islam or the Brotherhood, but it is essentially Arab culture. In the country where I come from, Somalia, about in the 1980s, Somalis were pretty much like my grandmother, or women like my grandmother, who had come to the city and they were struggling with urban life and living in the city, but they weren't struggling with, how these burqas and the jilbabs and submission to the male in the form that radical Islam introduced. And what did radical Islam introduce? It made Somali women into Arab women. The figures that I saw in the 1970s in Saudi Arabia, the same figures started to show up as Somalis, covered from head to toe. I saw some of them last night. So culture does matter. Islamic theology introduces a culture and a set of beliefs that is essentially Arab, that is patriarchal, that is sanctified and made divine. But again, and that is where I think that we lose the focus, that introduces a philosophy of the hereafter or a philosophy of death. And I'm glad that you are able to find a balance between the rewards that your faith, the theology, gives you spiritually, and building for yourself a life of, a life here on earth, investing in life here. But you are an exception to the rule. You're not the mainstream. The term dimitude, or the term dhimmi, is a legal term that is reserved for the people of the book where Islam rules. So where there is Sharia law or Islamic rule, minorities, if they were Jews or Christians, were considered to be dhimmis. Others were converted by the sword. The status of a dhimmi is what I think you would call a second-class citizen. For instance, dhimmis were not allowed to build their own synagogues or churches as, for them to show their worship. So churches had to be small, synagogues had to be small, you had to worship in secret. There were all sorts of government and commercial activities that you are not allowed to take part in if you are a dhimmi. You have a choice, of course, and when historians talk about how tolerant Islam was, where there was Islamic rule, where there was Islamic conquest, what they mean is that people were given the choice. If you became a Muslim, you became an equal. If you refused to become a Muslim and you were a Christian or a Jew, then you had that dhimmi status. A Muslim man can marry a Jewish woman, he can marry a Christian woman, but a Christian and a Jewish man cannot marry Muslim women. There were rules about what you could teach, propagating your own religion. For instance, proselytizing your religion in a Muslim country up to today is forbidden. That is the status of dhimitude. Dhimitude in Europe, as you point out, are the Europeans becoming dhimmis? Are they being colonized? That is a question that you can answer in different ways. There is no Islamic conquest today of Europe. It's not like Egypt or Syria or the Byzantine, parts of the Byzantine Empire. It is almost, I would say, for those who display a dhimmi status and concede and accommodate Muslim demands that are made by radical organizations, those who accommodate them, that is voluntary. It is in the belief that if we are nice to them, they'll be nice to us. It is, I find, a misplaced concept that if you allow radical Muslims to get their way for a while, somehow they're going to modernize easily and they'll refrain from violence. And I think it's the wrong way to go about it. Yeah, what do I think about Ground Zero and the building of a mosque there? I think, again, it demonstrates, first and foremost, that the 11th of September wasn't just the work of 19 men who were affiliated with a non-state actor. The convictions of Al-Qaeda are not really very different from the convictions of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and in fact the Muslim Brotherhood, that is the largest and most legitimate opposition group of Egypt. Building of that mosque there is, if it really goes ahead, will be seen as a great success, as something, and as if Allah is working in doing it himself. I find it tasteless. I find it insensitive. I find it very, morally wrong for the committee that approved it in New York to have approved it, but that's my opinion. And the thing is, in the United States, it's not unconstitutional. But if you're looking for an understanding back and forth, and many organized Muslims are telling us Islam is all about peace and understanding and dialogue, then I think it doesn't really display a great deal of sensitivity and understanding to build a mosque there, of all places. There are passionate reformists. There are people born into Islam who are struggling to keep the theology intact, to continue to believe, who are faithful to Islam and their communities that they are born into, and want to modernize. But they face all sorts of problems, as I mentioned, and it's not only now, it's been throughout the centuries. Muslim reformists face people within their faith who are willing to murder them and to die in the process of doing that. And it's not just a fringe group who's doing that. It's also well-established states. There's the story of Nasr Abu Zaid, who is now at the University of Leiden, where I studied political science. All he did was say, let's read parts of the Quran in context. He's a devout Muslim. He prays 5 times a day. You couldn't be more religious than that man. You couldn't be more faithful to Islam than that man. He was forced to divorce his wife. Some of the fundamentalists were asking for him to be hanged. Others went out of their way to go and kill him. And he finally fled the country and lives in the Netherlands and has no following whatsoever. But you look at people like Tariq Ramadan, an Islamist in the closet, in my view, and he has a huge following. You look at people like bin Laden and Az-Zawahiri and any number of the stars of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have huge followings. You look at someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who says that suicide killings are good and righteous, and he has a huge following. But Nasr Abu Zaidi doesn't have a huge following. Irshad Manji, who comes from this country, who's a passionate believer in reforming Islam, has no following. I have no following, even though and then I think, I'm not saying reform Islam, I'm saying get out of it as soon as you can. Which is, of course, a radically different story. But, there is no, it's very different. And it's because the faith is really instilled in, invest in the hereafter. And if people emancipate themselves from that concept of the hereafter, that is the true emancipation of the Muslim, lies in shedding the fear of what is going to happen to you in the grave and after the grave, then people will be able to reasonably think about, maybe like you, retaining part of their faith and their culture, but giving up jihad, giving up violence, and giving up sharia, the rule, the politics of Islam. I think that the media is biased in their reporting, biased meaning uncritical of Islam. The media is politically correct toward Islam as a theology. Most newspapers, and in fact the established newspapers of the West, report, for instance, on the war on terror, talk about terrorists. There's a whole lobby organized by the Organization of Islamic Conference, led by countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, etc., who are saying, do not link any of those terrorist activities to Islam. There is a lexicon that they put together, that they offered to the EU for journalists to use. So some of the journalists and some of the press have taken this over and will not use such terms as jihad or Islamist or Islamic terrorism. Fortunately, in the United States, some papers still do, but then the idea is that the media is engaged in self-censorship when it comes to reporting fully and objectively on Islam and Islamic theology. People like me who question the faith and the theology and the linkage between the conviction of the perpetrator and his act are labeled extremists, radicals, far-right, Islamophobes, xenophobes, etc. So the media is absolutely not objective and not fair in their reporting on Islam and all kinds of atrocities that are perpetrated in the name of Islam. If, for instance, you look at the reporting in Catholicism, I was following the pedophilia situation and how that was just headline news day after day after day, and there was no mercy. No mercy to the Catholics or the Church or the criticism of the Pope, and you compare that to the reporting on Islam, you'll be amazed at how different that is. The state of Israel is not a religious state, but if you look at the critical reporting that the media does on Israel, and you compare it to the reporting on Islam, you'll just be amazed at how the words that are used, the hyperbole against perceived atrocities committed by the state of Israel compared to real atrocities that are committed in the name of Islam. It is a way out for young men, an easy way out, a shortcut indeed, to go to heaven. If you think about it, all irrationalities have their own logic. The irrationality of earning a good place in heaven and investing in the hereafter also has its own logic. And if you know such concepts as, if you die as a martyr for the sake of Allah, all of your sins will be forgiven. The entire left book will disappear. That is one of the attractions for young men. So you're a young man, you live in the West, there are all these temptations. There's the glitter and the glamour of living in a Western world. Maybe you were born into a family with money, so you can afford it, and that makes temptation even more attractive. What do you do? And I think part of it explains why young men from middle-class families are joining the jihad, because the relief, the desire to just get out of it and do something great and go to the other side and get on with life is so powerful. So again, in analyzing this, I really, really hope that we move away from the simplicity of the promise of the 72 virgins. That is important, and it's just one of them, but also how difficult it is, how incredibly difficult it is, especially for young people, to live with the manual of the permitted and the forbidden, and to even observe the obligations. For instance, praying 5 times a day. Just for the sake of argument, please try and do it. It's really, really difficult. So once you want to get out of that straight-laced life, and if you go and you become a member of a jihadist group, you get a purpose. You join a group that is all struggling to do the same thing. They are all praying 5 times a day. They're all observing the rules. They're all refraining from whatever is considered haram or forbidden. And there is the goal of going to the other side. And even amongst them, there is competition. If you take the frustration argument, And you apply it to other people. I mean, humans meet with all kinds of adversities. And one of them was also, it was offered as an explanation for the Times Square bomber. He might have been frustrated with having lost his job. And when you read his profile, investigation shows that he gave up his job. He didn't lose it. What could he have been frustrated with? He applied for a visa as a student from Pakistan. He was living the American dream. He went to university. He earned a degree. I think it was a master's degree. He married an American woman. He had 2 children. He had a job. He seemed to be living the middle-class life that he earned. What was he frustrated with? That same frustration argument was used for Nidal Malik Hassan, the guy in November who killed 13 other members of the military. And again, extensive psychological speculation that he was suffering post-traumatic disorder. And it wasn't post-traumatic. He wasn't sent to combat, it appeared. So he was suffering a trauma in advance. But if you take the frustration argument, and that is why I think, I'm not sure what, I can't comment on a study that I haven't actually read, but I'm familiar with the frustration argument. And you apply it to other people who are frustrated. The lady sitting there works with me, and we were talking about losing your job or because of foreclosures and then buying an SUV and putting gasoline in their fertilizer and trying to blow up Times Square. She was laid off with hundreds of others from Wall Street. None of those people who suffered Wall Street and the financial losses have come up with the idea of blowing up Wall Street. People may have fantasized about it, but they haven't done it. And I think that if you divorce the action of the person wanting to die from his convictions, then again you're going to have another hypothesis that doesn't work. And the hypothesis that it is frustration, it's disaffection, has been the dominant hypothesis. The hypothesis that they've been humiliated, and that's what they're frustrated with. And so the West has been pouring money into Arab Muslim countries, trying to woo them into liking us. Obama has been going all over the place. It hasn't changed anything. So the frustration hypothesis is wrong. It doesn't apply. You can say you're frustrated with your father and you're going to blow up your neighbor. That's a different story, but I don't think that that frustration argument is plausible. In analyzing the frame, why are Muslims trying to blow themselves up? Why are Muslim children not integrating into modern society? What is going on? I'm not starting with, there is a war. I know there is a war going on. I completely accept the hypothesis of Samuel Huntington that there is a clash of civilizations, and these civilizations are very different. But in trying to understand the logic behind some of the aggression and the violence and the decision-making of countries, families in the Islamic world, I think it is very, very important to understand what the hereafter means in that society and why people invest in the hereafter. And then the concepts of war, the concepts of jihad, the black and white thinking becomes apparent. Now, I don't think that the response from the West should be to wage war against Islam or Muslims. I think that you use military action where it's necessary. You use police action on a domestic level where that is necessary, but that the real war is the war of ideas. In other words, that you offer to those who invest in a hereafter a different set of beliefs, a philosophy for life on earth. And in that, we are not competing with the jihadists for the hearts and minds of people who are born into Islam to give up the philosophy of the hereafter and adopt a philosophy for life. First of all, I'm not calling for Muslims to become Christians. I'm encouraging Christians and atheists and humanists and feminists to compete with Islamists for the hearts and minds of, yes, those over 1 billion Muslims. Now, we'll find out whether the idea is simplistic or not if we have fair competition. Let's just offer them the idea. Right now, it's not happening. We know that ideas are powerful. We know that the human mind, once you offer them alternatives, will pick and choose what he or she feels is most appropriate for them. I have met numerous ex-Muslims who are now Christian, and they have told me that they don't want to become atheists. And it's very clear to me from the evidence of that group of ex-Muslims who are now Christians that maybe my atheism is not as powerful as the other idea that appealed to them, Christianity is. Given the pace at which radical Islam is moving, given the demography that is vulnerable to the ideas of jihad, I don't think that it's enough to wait for a solution to come from within Islam and for reforming Islam. But I would definitely encourage any reformist, sincerely reformist Muslim or Muslim organization to also appeal to that same demography, to let go of that philosophy of the hereafter. But given the scale of the problem, it's not enough to wait for the solution to come only from Islam and by Muslims. It's something that we all face. It's a problem that we all face.